Om Naumi Chit Pratibham Devi Param Bhairava Yogini Matarmana Prameyansha Shulam Bhuja Kritaspadam. Om, salutations to that goddess who is inseparable from Bhairava, who is the supreme reality that manifests itself in the trinity of knowers, knowing and known. Salutations to that goddess who abides in the lotus heart, mounted atop the trident. Om Param Parastham Gahanadanadim Ekam Nivishtam Bahudha Guhasu Sarvalayam Sarvacharacharastham Tvameva Shambhu Sharanam Prapadye. I bow at the feet of that Guru Shambhu, who is none other than Para, the transcendent reality beyond this abyss of transmigratory existence. I praise that goddess who is beginningless and endless, who is non-dual, who manifests in the hearts of all the variously manifested beings, who is wholly immanent in the moving and unmoving. I praise that goddess who is the ground of all reality, in which everything rests. Om Asmadrupa Samavishtaha Swatmanatma Nivarane Shiva Karotu Nijaya Namaha Shaktya Tatatmane Namaha Shaktya Tatatmane. Om, salutations to Shiva, who has penetrated and possessed my form by hiding himself from himself. Salutations to that Shiva, who is all-pervasive by the means of his own power. Salutations to the non-dual, all-pervasive Shiva. Om Bhaya Sarvam Ravayati Sarvago Vyapako Kile Iti Bhairava Shabdasya Santato Charanachiva Chantato Charanachiva. Om Bhairava is that awe-inspiring sound that resounds in all things as all things. By constantly contemplating Bhairava, one becomes Bhairava. May this be an offering to that reality. Om Shanti 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 Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Om peace, peace, peace. Jai Ma. Gang, it's so wonderful to talk to you today on a very, very auspicious day. I'm talking to you from New York today, which is quite exciting, and I'm always very excited when I come to New York. I'm particularly inspired whenever I give talks in New York, because this is the place that Swami Vivekananda spent so much of his time speaking and teaching and spreading the message of the oneness of all existence, a radical, most inclusive form of non-duality. Here it is that he taught people to revere the individual self, God as the human being. Here he told people that there's innate divinity to being human, innate divinity to all life, even to inanimate objects. And it was here that he preached the harmony of all religions, of course all over America, but particularly in New York his work was rather concentrated. So when I come here I get very excited. So hello, so nice that you could join me here today on Shivaratri, on the second day of the Ambubachi Mela. And we'll talk about a few things. Like, we'll have to talk about the Ambubachi Mela, the day when mother's yoni bleeds in Kamakya. So we can talk about mother's menstruation and the significance of menstrual blood and all that. That will be part of the flow of tonight's discussion, I hope. But secondly, also we'll talk a little bit about Shivaratri and Navaratri, because tonight is Shivaratri, the Masik Shivaratri, the one that happens monthly, not the Magha Maha Shivaratri. So it's the monthly Shivaratri. We'll talk a little bit about that, which is happening tonight and on a Monday, no less. And then we'll talk about Navaratri. So tomorrow is the new moon, Amavasya. Then the day after that is going to be the first day of the 9 nights of Durga, known as Gupta Navaratri. So there are 3 big festivals that we have to mention tonight. I think would be valuable to talk about: the Ambubachi Mela, the sacred tantric fertility festival, among other things, the Shivaratri, the Masika Shivaratri, which happens to fall on a Monday, which is tonight, and thirdly, maybe 4 things. Amavasya itself is something worth talking about, and fourthly, Navaratri. So there's so many auspicious things happening all at once. So on this very auspicious evening, to be able to speak to you here in New York, it's a rare delight. Thank you so much for having me and for being here. I want to talk about something especially radical tonight anyway. Just because it's Shivaratri, I want to maybe present to you the most radical, most thrilling, most inspiring form of Advaita. It's a kind of Advaita that goes far beyond classical Advaita Vedanta, in my opinion, in its radical inclusivity. So where other schools of Advaita achieve Advaita by dismissing some reality or other, like, oh, this is a superimposition of the mind, or this is void, or this is illusion, this kind of Advaita, rather than dismissing any aspect of reality, attempts to reintegrate everything. So you have this like living, pulsating, throbbing, inclusive whole, this one unitive consciousness in which every dimension of life is reclaimed as divine. And you can see that has to do with Ambubachi Mela as well. So this kind of Advaita, it's found in a very important text, which I haven't really started studying with you in a systematic way. I mean to. But if you've studied my talks to any extent, you would have found, I think, throughout the various talks that I've given over the years, my loyalty, as far as our philosophical standing seems to go toward this particular text that I want to introduce you to tonight. So there are many different texts, of course, in the Shaiva, Shākta, non-dual world, but it's this text and the vision of this text, I think, with which I resonate the most, and which I think Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna resonate with the most. And of course, I'm talking about none other than the Shiva Drishti. Shiva, meaning the ultimate nature of reality. Drishti, meaning the view of Shiva, or the school of Shiva, or the way to look at reality from the point of view of Shiva, or the way to look at reality as Shiva, or Shiva's point of view. There's so many different ways to translate this text. Drishti means to see. A view, it means a view. And you can see that it's related to the word darshana. In Indian philosophy, when we name a school of philosophy, that school is called a darshana. So it's like Nyaya Darshana, or Sankhya Darshana, or Yoga Darshana. These are all various different schools of philosophy. But that school of philosophy itself is a way of seeing the world. It's a way of relating to yourself, it's a way of relating to others, and it's a way of relating to the world without and within. And the different kinds of darshanas are rooted in different kinds of religious experiences. So the first thing to note is that in Indian philosophy, no distinction is made between philosophy and theology, between philosophy and religion. You could say the two go hand in hand. Very rarely will you have a religion that is not philosophically grounded in India. And very rarely will you have a philosophy that doesn't refer to some kind of experiential, metaphysical basis. So like there is a darshana, meaning a vision of reality. There is a drishti, a view that comes about through spiritual inspiration, through spiritual ecstasies, whatever you want to call them. So some kind of yogic or mystic vision is usually at the heart of all these darshanas. Hence they are called darshanas. They have a soteriology to them, meaning their purpose is to provide you with that same experience so that you too can go beyond all forms of suffering and maybe additionally attain the highest bliss. Not always. In some of these darshanas, attaining the highest bliss is not a given. Going beyond all suffering, though, is pretty much common to all the darshanas. Some darshanas stop there. Like there are some schools of philosophy where the only thing you should be interested in fact the only thing you can be interested in, is dukkha nivritti, or atyantika dukkha nivritti, the permanent and categorical end of all suffering, and there it ends. But some other schools of philosophy, they say no, there's something more. It's not just the permanent end of all suffering, it's also the attainment of something really rich and profound and fulfilling. So this is called Paramananda Prapti, the attainment of supreme bliss. So in short, in sum, soteriology is the question of what will it take for me as a human being to attain my maximum fulfillment, which means two things, right? In one sense, it means to never suffer again, or to be able to experience grief and pain in a way that's not suffering. So there is a way actually to cry when I lose a loved one, or a way to experience physical pain that might not constitute suffering. It could be like a radical enlivenment or something like that. So the goal is not to go beyond all pain or all grief, unless it is. In some spiritual traditions, the goal is actually to go beyond all forms of embodiment, all forms of psychology, in order to go beyond all forms of physical and psychological pain. But even then, even assuming that there will be pain and grief, one desires to not suffer anymore. So the quest, soteriologically speaking, is to end all suffering. The atyantika dukkha nivritti, the categorical end of all suffering. So it can't just be like a temporary solve, it can't just be like a band-aid where for 1 week I don't suffer and then the next 3 weeks I suffer. Like that movie, The Substance, it's not like that. It must be a permanent fix. It must be something that will actually categorically, unequivocally take you beyond all forms of suffering. That's what it means to say atyantika dukkha nivritti, the categorical end of all suffering. And that might be enough for many people, by the way. Nirvana, just kind of negatively defined, like as the blowing out of something, as the ending of something. That something can be called samsara, the wheel of cyclic existence. It can be called dukkha, suffering. It can be called impermanence. It can even be called unreality or illusion, whatever you want to call it. But ending that, going beyond that, is the goal. That's the goal for many, many schools of spiritual philosophy in India and all around the world. So this is one version. But there's another version where it's not just this, it's also the attainment of something. Maybe this is something you don't already have, which you will come to have as a result of this soteriology. So maybe right now, you aren't yet omniscient and omnipotent. But as a result of attaining the highest vision of reality, you become omniscient and omnipotent. So this idea of becoming powerful, empowered, is a kind of important idea in the Shaiva Tantras. In Shaiva Siddhanta also, in the most orthodox dualistic school of Shaivism, even there, it's not enough that categorically you go beyond all suffering. You must also attain something more, which is called the attainment of supreme bliss. But here it's couched in terms of empowerment. So what it looks like to attain supreme bliss is to become Shiva, to become omnipotent and omnipresent, like to become omniscient, like God. So to become God is the goal, arguably. Even in Shaiva Siddhanta, you'll see that's kind of stressed. Of course, God is still God, but as a result of attaining the highest reality, according to the most orthodox dualistic school of dualistic school of Tantra, you still gain something. You become empowered in some way. Not so for the Pashupata dualist. For early Shaivas, there was no guarantee that you would gain something. It's enough that you go beyond all suffering. What more you want? They'll make arguments like, if you gain something, then that's something that can also be lost, because it's something that you didn't have before. And now if you have something that you didn't have before, then it stands to reason that it can also go away. So why gain anything? But the same argument can be applied to dukkha nivritti. You can say, well, I was suffering, now I'm no longer suffering. Who's to say I won't start suffering again in the future? So this idea that my salvation starts at a given point, that is disputed. So these philosophies, whether they're about dukkha nivritti only, or whether they're about dukkha nivritti and paramananda prapti, they eventually start articulating a new sense of what that would look like. Recognition. The idea that I was always already free, I just didn't know it, and that's why I was suffering, and that's why I was not attaining the best, most fulfilling experience. But now, once I remove the veils, so to speak, once I become aware of what was always the case, once I remove what was never there, and once I gain what was always mine, then I am free. So this is a slightly subtler, more refined way of arguing for soteriology. But whatever the framework is, these schools of philosophy that we study together are, I don't want to say religious, maybe the word is spiritual, but I think the best, most technically precise word is soteriological. They are all offering some solution to the problems of life. That's the thing. So that's why they're called darshanas, because they're not merely philosophies. Like, by the way, you could study a Bachelor of Arts program at some very good university, and by the end of that, you might know a lot about Kant or Aquinas or something. You might be able to talk a lot about the existentialist philosophers like Camus or Sartre or whatnot, but it's not a guarantee that you will be happy. In fact, that's not what the program promises you. If you pay the money and you pay your tuition, you go to class every day and you have a good GPA, you'll come out of that a Bachelor of Arts in philosophy. You'll still be unemployed, don't worry. Even the program cannot guarantee. Yeah, Gene is right on the money here. Many of you know because you're part of this world. But yeah, you'll come out and you'll be like, hey, where's my job? I thought I was getting a job. The university would say, nowhere did we guarantee that you'd get a job. And then you say, but I'm still a miserable asshole. I spent 4 years in your college studying all the best philosophers, and now I'm still a miserable asshole. And the school will say, we never guaranteed you a job. We never guaranteed that you would get over your psychological issues. We're not here to do that. We're here to give you a set of information. And with that, you can write good papers, I once having a kind of somewhat unnecessary discussion with a fellow friend of mine, a philosophically minded gentleman, and we're just kind of talking about stuff, and he's coming from a very different point of view. He's like an intellectual in a university. So I was like, what's the point of this though? What's the pragmatic benefit of this view? And he says, I don't know, you could write a paper, I guess. That was the ultimate outcome of his philosophy. It was that this would be valuable because he could contribute to writing a paper. And that's fine, not to knock it. It's just that that's not the goal that we have in mind when we do this kind of philosophy. So if you're doing philosophy for philosophy's sake, that's wonderful. Not to bash that, that's really good. One should refine one's intellect in that way. It actually prepares us spiritually. But it's not necessarily going to give you atyantika dukkha nivritti or paramananda prapti. Sometimes it can give you more suffering actually, because now you can never go out on dates anymore. You become insufferable. You just kind of mansplain existentialism to somebody. So maybe it makes your suffering worse and it makes you further and further away from bliss. So it's not a guarantee that if you just study philosophy at a university, if you get a PhD in philosophy, it's not a guarantee that you will be permanently happy and beyond all suffering. Whereas the darshanas of Indian philosophy, the goal is that. So if you don't attain that soteriological promise, then you're not doing it right. You're like a flower without fragrance, or like a body without prana. Those things are useless. Similarly, a pandita, a scholar without any spiritual experience, is just like a flower without fragrance, just like a body without prana, in other words, a corpse. Take it out of the room, it's useless. So the claim is that, no, if you're going to do philosophy, actually do philosophy. Don't just think. Do spiritual practices, yogic exercises, mystical techniques in order to realize for yourself that reality from which these words came. So the words are like an afterthought describing a reality that these philosophers felt for themselves. Now, this is the first point I want to make in tonight's discussion. I'm going to put before you an incredibly radical philosophy. In fact, it's so radical that it might even be a little disturbing to some people, frustrating and disturbing to some people. But you have to remember that this isn't just some fellows like intellectual masturbation. It isn't just a person sitting down thinking, how edgy can I be? Can I be the edgelord of my era? It's not like some university student in some dorm room trying to out edgelord the roommate. Oh yeah, that's from Nietzsche? Well, guess what? I have an even more nihilist thing to say than that. And like that, it's not like that. It's not like these people are trying to be edgy for the sake of being edgy. This is a person who actually experienced reality in this way. As a result of their spiritual practices, philosophical inquiry, and as a result of the grace of God, you could say, they saw reality in this way. And so they spoke about it. They described it. So the person I have in mind for tonight's lecture is Somānanda, a great Maheshwaracharya, teacher of Shaivism. And we'll talk a little bit about him, who he is and what he has to do with our lineage and all that. So we'll talk about Somānanda and then his masterpiece, which is, by the way, a very difficult text. It's one of the most difficult texts in the tradition, and therefore I thought it's better we do some Paramarthasara, better we do some Tantra Sara, better look at Abhinava Gupta first, because he's so masterfully presents the whole tradition and reconciles a lot of things prior to him. But then also maybe we can look at Utpaladeva. Ishvara Siddhi is a nice and concise text, or something like Ishvara Pratyabhigya Karika, which is also quite difficult. But then Somānanda's work is very difficult, also because the manuscripts are kind of dodgy, and maybe the whole work is not all the way there, and the vritti, Utpaladeva's vritti is missing. Anyway, all of these it's missing parts, but all these academic details aside, it's a difficult text. What is available, the 7 books of Somānanda's, or the 7 chapters of Somānanda's Shiva Drishti is a difficult book, because it attempts to deal with other schools of philosophy, in other words, other religions that were present at that time on the subcontinent. So it's a philosophical treatise that makes reference to other schools, it defends its own position, but you have to remember above all that when we study the Shiva Drishti by Somānanda, you have to remember above all that this is somebody's religious experience. In other words, this is one way in which you can see reality. That alone to me is thrilling. Whether or not we come to see reality in this way, I think is beside the point. I mean, it isn't. It's really important that we come to see reality in this way insofar as we desire that, I think. But in one sense, it's not really that exciting. To me, what's more exciting is that reality can be seen in this way. Whether I see it in this way or not, that's somehow less important to me than the fact that someone did, that it is possible to have this experience. And God willing, we will all have it also. So it wasn't just Somānanda, I'm going to argue, who had this experience, which he talks about in his Shiva Drishti. It's also Sri Ramakrishna. There are, of course, parallel passages in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna and in the Leela Prasanga where Sri Ramakrishna describes a very similar vision of reality. And naturally, because Swami Vivekananda is Sri Ramakrishna's foremost disciple, unsurprisingly, naturally, Swami Vivekananda expresses a very similar vision of reality. And the claim that we make is that Somānanda's vision, Ramakrishna's vision, and Vivekananda's vision, they might all be the same vision, and they're radically non-dual in a way that maybe even other forms of Advaita are not willing to go. I'm not saying it's better because it's more radical. I'm just saying it's different. And so I want to put before you today, in sum, a very radically inclusive school of non-dual philosophy. And I'm going to couch it in the language of the Shiva Drishti, using Somānanda as kind of our guide. But it's important to me that you know that not only did Somānanda have this experience, but many others did too. Perhaps Utpaladeva, perhaps Lakshmana Gupta, perhaps Abhinava Gupta, many people who we'll meet today, and perhaps all of us here who are gathered in this room. It is my sincere prayer that we too may come to see reality in this way. Not pending some kind of mystical experience that may or may not happen, but now itself it may be possible for this kind of vision to arise just through contemplating it. This is a kind of spiritual practice. It's called Shākta Upaya, where we refine our intellects, where we rehearse certain thought forms which have the power to take us beyond the mind and into direct experiential knowledge. So that being said, this is exciting because when you look at the world through Shiva Drishti's lens, in other words, through Somānanda's lens, you can get a glimpse of what he saw for yourself and be permanently established in that, which, by the way, has a soteriological force. You'll be permanently free of all suffering, and you will attain the ultimate bliss. And if I may be hierarchical or sectarian for just a moment, I think, just from just an anecdotal point of view, don't take it too seriously, this is a much funner soteriology. Funner in the sense that it allows for more engagement with life, with one another, with the world. It's a kind of soteriology that, in my opinion, is the most life-affirming. Of all the various forms of soteriology that we find in the various schools of philosophy, not just in the Indian subcontinent, but all over the world, this is my favorite. Personally, just anecdotally. But it might not be the case for you. So I'm not making a sectarian or hierarchical point, just a personal one. So I really like the outcome of this soteriology, because it allows for one to remain in the world with eyes open, radically enjoying yourself. You know, the reason why this is a disturbing philosophy is because I imagine someone who approaches religion in a more dualistic way, in a more moralistic way, who might want something like growth or healing or learning or growing or something, like that person will be disturbed with this view, I think. And they might even call it out as like outright demonic or asuric, because it's like, it almost seems like hedonism. In one way, shape or form, I'm going to argue for just living your life as an act of God. And some people are like, is that even religion? Yes, it is, because it's grounded in the experience that sarvam shivatmakam. This is the key. It's not that I'm just going about hacking and slashing, trying to find infinite joy and finite pleasures. It's not that. It's that every finite pleasure, whether it's the taste of a chocolate cake or an orgasm or feet in the grass or a poem or some piece of music or some wound or something, like all of this becomes infinitely valuable because one recognizes the divinity in it. It's like, it's not just I'm going about my life doing whatever I want. I am going about my life doing whatever I want, but constantly with this sense of poetic rapture, encountering God in all things, as all things. But now there's nothing beyond this. The claim is that this is it. Like, you want freedom? This is it. Like, you're already absolutely free as you are, and so too is your coffee cup. That's the craziness of this claim. So it's going to even argue, I'm sorry, but your AI is conscious. And the reason your AI is conscious is because rocks are conscious, tables are conscious. Conscious in the way that you are conscious. In that it can will, and it can know, and it can do. It's like a remarkable view. It's a view that it dismisses the distinction between chit and jara, sentient and insentient. So this is the view I want to present to you tonight. But never forget, this is a darshana. A philosophical school, which means it's grounded in a mystical experience that even if I don't have, somebody had. That's important to me, that somebody had this experience, and more than one, like Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, you can add to the list of innumerable sages who have had this non-dual experience, special kind of non-dual experience. And St. Anthony is bringing up a good point here. Of course, we can make comparisons to things like panentheism, pantheism, panpsychism. No doubt, this is a kind of pan philosophy. Not Peter Pan, but it's a pan philosophy in that it's like an all-inclusive kind of thing. So like these other kind of pans, you know, panpsychism, pantheism, panentheism. These are all terms in Western philosophy to describe religious experiences, philosophical schools. And of course, we can compare the view of Somānanda, this incredibly profound non-dual view, to some of these other things too. That might be like a long-term project for us. Okay, but anyway, one day, I think we'll all sit down and we'll just like verse by verse go over this text. I chanted the first verse for you just now before we started the talk, but one day we'll just go over it verse by verse, 7 books like that. Today I'm just gonna like just play around with it, just tell you a few ideas from just kind of a sort of gloss of the whole thing, just the view of Shiva Drishti. So again, Drishti is a related word to Darshana. Darshana means a way of looking at reality, so all schools of philosophy are grounded in some kind of yogic or mystic revelation. But this is very important. In Indian philosophy, I mean the subcontinent, which now can be considered Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, like that whole region, China, parts of China, Tibet, that whole region, one thing you notice about these mystics is that they were very interested in grounding their mysticism in philosophy. So very rarely does a person have a profound soteriological experience and then fail to like somehow grounded in reason, logic, and rationality. It's almost as if something is true, it is true beyond the powers of the mind to understand, and yet no attempts are spared in trying to help us understand, even on the level of the mind. So I think that's very unique, actually, very beautiful, because some people are all intellect, no mystic experience. Yeah, what's the point of that? Again, it's like a flower without fragrance. But other people are all mystical experience, but no ability to convey it, no ability to ground it and reason it out and present it in a way that's like direct and rational and clear. So what we get with these masters, Somānanda, Utpaladeva, Abhinava Gupta, and of course Vivekananda, Ramakrishna, etc., is the ability to actually articulate these profound transmental states that they've experienced. So Somānanda is perhaps the example par excellence. I mean, maybe Abhinava Gupta might be the example par excellence of a polymath mystic, someone who's experienced God and is actually refined and culturally developed enough to be able to convey that experience, at least to some extent, through poetry, through writing, through talking, through teaching, like that. So Somānanda is a special case. He's somebody who's had this mystic experience. Remember, it's called a darshana, and the book is importantly titled Drishti, view, which refers to something experiential. But also it refers to the philosophical sense of, like, it's a philosophical presentation of a particular way of being and of seeing the world. So drishti, meaning view, meaning darshana, the school of, that's one way to think of it. And you know, it's so simple. The school of Shiva. It's the Shiva Drishti, the way of seeing of Shiva, or I prefer to translate this title as the experience of Shiva. What is it like to experience Shiva? Arguably like this. And that's what Somānanda is going to tell us over the course of 7 books or 7 chapters. Shiva Drishti, the experience of Shiva. And my prayer is that by studying this, like obviously we'll do a systematic study another time, but like by contemplating these ideas, my prayer is that we too can see like Shiva sees, or we too can see Shiva, or we too will at least intellectually come to understand how radical non-dual Shaivism is. It's non-dual in a way that like is so unique, and that's worth pointing out. You know, it's worth pointing out what makes this brand of Advaita so unique and so different from all the other equally great, equally beautiful forms of Advaita that you might have encountered prior to this conversation. Thank you, Ruth. So yeah, it's Shiva Drishti. So by Somānanda, and maybe we'll start with a few things about Somānanda. Okay, so Somānanda. But before that, like just a few things about why this would be a good conversation to have right now. Somānanda is maybe the founder, I would argue the founder of the school known as Pratyabhikya, which is a very important school that influences Abhinava Gupta and influences the tantric world as a whole. So Tantra is a very diverse tradition, but modern Tantra is suffused with the all-pervasive presence of Pratyabhikya. Arguably, the school developed in Kashmir because a lot of its authors, its exegetical, post-scriptural authors were based in Kashmir, but not necessarily. Like it was, again, another pan word, a pan-Indian phenomenon. So like there are authors in Maharashtra, for instance, and South India, like Maheshwarananda and others, who are all recording these visions and writing about it. And so it's not quite fair to call it Kashmir Shaivism, but when people say Kashmir Shaivism, referring to like the work that was created in this region, they usually have this kind of philosophy in mind. So you could say Pratyabhikya might be its formal name, if it can even be said to have one, the recognition school, or sometimes it's called Svatantriyavada, the doctrine of freedom, or the doctrine of self-expansion. So either you can call it the doctrine of recognition or the doctrine of freedom, but a lot of people often mean this when they say the word Kashmir Shaivism. And you could argue that Vasugupta and Bhatta Karata started this tradition with the text Shiva Sutra. So Shiva Sutra might be like the first text of this tradition. And even the Kashmir series of texts and studies, when it published a lot of these for a long time lost manuscripts, it started with the Shiva Drishti. Actually, technically, it started with K.C. Pandey's introduction called Kashmir Shaivism. That's actually why scholars call it Kashmir Shaivism, probably because K.C. Pandey called it that in the introduction to the monumental and very important work, the Kashmiri series of texts and studies, which is where most of our manuscripts come from, where the original primary sources come from for the stuff that we're going to talk about. And the first text there is, unsurprisingly and very naturally, the Shiva Sutra by Vasugupta towards the middle of the 9th century, probably. Somānanda was active probably from like 900 to 950 AD. So I think modern dating puts him somewhere like to the beginning, towards the middle of the 10th century. So in the 9th century, you had Shiva Sutra. In the 10th century, you had Somānanda. And of course, Utpaladeva. And towards the end of the 10th century, you had Abhinava Gupta and whatnot. So this is very important. This is very, very important because you could argue that Vasugupta founded the tradition, but I think it would be better to say that Somānanda did, because a lot of the terms that we get in Utpaladeva, in Abhinava Gupta, you can trace them back to Somānanda specifically. And more importantly, what Vasugupta and what Kalata Bhatta seem to be giving us is more mystical, religious, and yogic in flavor. But what Somānanda is giving us is more philosophical, rational, and clear in terms of tone. So it's Somānanda who really takes the time to ground this vision of reality in philosophical terms, thereby presenting it as a coherent school that can stand amongst the other very coherent, very developed philosophical systems of India, which again are all grounded in mystical experience. So where Kalata Bhatta and his predecessor Vasugupta were content to kind of stay within, the religious world of mystical experience with their aphorisms, Somānanda was willing to, or able to arguably, give it a philosophical, exegetical, explanatory force also, if you will. Okay, so having said all of that, you could even argue that Somānanda is the founder of this tradition called the Pratyabhikya. But again, it would be wrong to say that this is a standalone tradition because it's a repository of many different traditions. For instance, you can sense a very strong Kaula or Krama leaning in Somānanda. Now, some of you in the chat some time ago on Discord were wondering, what's the difference between Shaivism and Shaktism? Is there even a difference? Is there such thing as like Shākta schools and Shaiva schools? No and yes. No, I always argue no, because in Shaivism you have a whole range of attitudes, and the more non-dual you become, in other words, the more left-leaning, if I may say it that way, you tend to be more goddess-oriented. So Shiva svabhavaha iti shaktihi, as Abhinava Gupta would say. So Abhinava Gupta is a Maheshwaracharya, a teacher of Shaivism, but his Ishta is probably Anakya. Anakya is his word for Kali. So he sees Kali as the essential nature of ultimate reality. So he uses the word Kali to describe that tattva which is beyond all tattvas. But he's a Shaiva teacher. So arguably, Shaivas, like myself, would worship the Divine Mother Kali. Does that make us Shaktas? I mean, yes, because we're worshipping Shakti. So if by Shakta you mean one who performs the rites of Shakti worship, then Abhinava Gupta is a Shākta. But however, you have to also remember that there are some other schools of philosophy that at that time were specifically called Shākta as juxtaposed to Shaiva, and in Somānanda's work, it seems like he's responding to Shākta philosophies, which is very interesting. It almost suggests that there might have been two schools, and so we can get into that discussion another time. The general TLDR of it is that Shaktism is a mode of Shaivism. Within the world of Shaiva Tantra, you have Tantras that focus on the goddess, and these are what we might call Shakti Tantras. Or you could say there's an autochthonous tradition that exists in India oriented around the goddess, and it gets brought into Shaivism, and then Shaivism develops soteriologies and theologies and practices and philosophies around Shakti as its principal focus. But I think this is all semantics. It doesn't matter whether it's Shaiva or Shakta. The one thing you cannot deny, though, in Somānanda is a kind of Kaula leaning. Whatever that word Kaula means to you, Somānanda seems to be very Kaula, in that he finds the world to be intrinsically pure. There's no category of pure or impure. Everything is as much God as everything else. And so even polluting substances, like for instance menstrual blood, can be seen as the synonymous with the highest nature of reality, like that. So Somānanda, not only is he a Kaula in that he dismisses illusory notions of pure and impure, he's a Kaula in that he invites engagement with the world. That his kind of spirituality is one that invites us to kiss, and to make love, and to eat chocolate cake, and to fight wars, and to help one another out. A kind of philosophy that brings us into the world, seeing as the world is nothing other than God's embodiment. So that's the kind of interesting thing about Somānanda. He's a Shaiva teacher, but he leans Kaula by virtue of this revelation. So you could say there's Krama influence maybe, or Kaula influence. Definitely Kaula influence. I don't know if we can say there's Krama influence. That might be going too far. But I think you could argue the case. There's definitely Trika influence. In fact, arguably he founds the, he doesn't found the Trika, but arguably he does. And I'm going to make an argument for why. How he is the inheritor of the Trika tradition. And in him, the Trika, I think, finds its foundational philosophy. Of course, the Trika exists in texts like the Malini Vijayotaro Tantra. There are these primary sources that present the Trika, but Somānanda might be the first post-scriptural writer, which I don't mean in terms of chronology, but in status. He's the first exegetical writer or master to present the philosophical school known as Trika, which Abhinava Gupta will, of course, really expand upon and use as his foundational harmonizing principle, which is also true for Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and Sarada. So this Trika principle is true in our lineage. We can see it with Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and Sarada. We can, of course, also see it with Abhinava Gupta. And I think it's first maybe formulated in Somānanda. And of course, it can all be traced back to this revelation of Lord Shiva called the Malini Vijayotaro Tantra, as well as other tantras in which the Trika formulation appears. So if these words don't mean anything to you right now, it's no big deal. Just for those like specialists in the room, I think you can call it Pratyabhigya, like what Somānanda wants to present to us. You can call it that, but you can't ignore that it's Trika. It's Trika through and through with the kind of Kaula leaning. So you could say it's already a synthesis of pan-Indian tantric movements that have existed for centuries outside of Kashmir, that were all kind of flowing into Kashmir at that time and influencing its masters, writers, and teachers. So Trika, Krama, Kaula, these are all streams that flow in the confluence known as Pratyabhigya. So if you want to think of Pratyabhigya and Spanda as a standalone philosophy, you can, but you have to remember also in India, a lot of things it's not so clear like that. It's fluid. These things share DNA, like how so much Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism, especially like Madhyamika Buddhism, seem to share so much DNA and seem to like have so many similar parallel kind of understandings like that. Because these things, and you can even argue that some have argued that Somānanda's entire Shiva Drishti is influenced a lot by Vijnanavada Buddhism, where Vijnanavadins, a Buddhist school, recognize the inherence of consciousness in all things as all things in the famous maxim, Nila Darshana, Nilam Abhedam. There's no difference between the perception of blue and the color blue. The argument here is that when I see something that's blue, I cannot show that there exists in reality some independent objective reality called blue that exists apart from my seeing blue. It's a very profound statement that my seeing blue is synonymous with the color blue, and that blue itself, blueness, does not exist outside of my own subjective first-person experience. So this entire universe is cognized within my subjective first-person experience, and therefore no independent objective reality apart from this perception can be proved. So what do all things in the universe have in common? Whether known or unknown, whether perceived or unperceived, whether knowable or unknowable, perceivable or unperceivable, all things in the universe, past, present, future, potential or actual, they all share one thing in common: perception. In other words, consciousness. You see, everything is in consciousness, and that was a revelation, arguably, that the Vijnanavadins articulated first. And arguably Vijnanavada Buddhism really influences, it seems to influence Somānanda. So it's not quite clear like, okay, this is Pratyabhigya, this is Spanda, or let's just call this Swatantriya or whatever. It's so hard to like name it. So I think it's just nice to talk about it as the view presented by one great master named Somānanda in the text Shiva Drishti. Maybe we don't need to say more than that. Maybe we don't need to assign a label to it. Like it's the Pratyabhigya, or it's the Spanda, or it's the foundational Trika text, or it's influenced by Vijnanavada Buddhism, and it's like a response to Dharma Kriti and other forms of Buddhism at the time. Like, that's going to be true of any school of Indian philosophy. It's all sharing DNA with all the other schools of philosophy. It's so exciting, so interesting. And it's because the ultimate nature of reality is one. And these are all just different ways of looking at the same thing, of realizing the same reality. And so naturally they're going to share a lot of overlap, It's just the emphasis might be different, which makes this study so exciting. What you might have heard from your Lama or from your Acharya might be one thing. And it's the same thing that we're saying here, but the emphasis is slightly different, which can make these two views mutually enforcing. So that's the exciting thing. Okay, so having said that, this is the view that Somānanda presents in the Shiva Drishti. And you can call it Pratyabhigya or Spanda, but it definitely, undoubtedly has elements of Trika, elements of Krama. And it undoubtedly has a kind of Kaula leaning, maybe. Yeah. I'm not going to comment on how Buddhist philosophies affected these schools or how these schools affected Buddhist philosophies. It's just obvious that these schools were affecting one another. And because I'm myself not a lineage holder in any Buddhist sampradaya, and because I'm not a specialist in Buddhism, I'll refrain from like making any claims about how this school affected Buddhism or how Buddhist schools affected these schools. I can only speak within the tradition, and therefore I'm only going to speak within the Shaiva tantric world. So that being said, I just want to reference the fact that you could make a strong case for the Vijnanavada base for this text, and how this text comes to influence a lot of Buddhism afterwards. But anyway, all that aside, let's say a few things about Somānanda. Who is Somānanda? Again, he can be dated between 900 to 950 AD. And you'll see in the Discord here, this might be helpful to some of you. There's a kind of origin story that you should be familiar with when we approach texts like this. So before I can give you the view, it's nice to maybe start with a little bit of context. Like, what are these tantras? Like, what is the non-dual tantric tradition? What are we talking about here? So we'll start with this. The Vedas. And this is very important because like all of arguably the Sanatana Dharma traditions, that word it can be difficult to understand also, but all of the traditions on the subcontinent, they argue, they make the claim that they can be based and traced to the Vedas. They're based in and traced to the Vedas. And the Vedas are a kind of revelation that exists separate from any kind of deity. So it's not like a deity reveals the Vedas. The Vedas just exist. But sometimes a human interlocutor is needed to understand these Vedas, and so we need rishis. So rishis, the rishi is one who can hear these mantras through states of deep meditation. So the mantras already exist. Again, as Swami Vivekananda said, by Veda, no books are meant. Veda just means knowledge. So spiritual knowledge, the sum total of all spiritual knowledge, is always vibrating, always resounding in the ether, if you will. And certain people have been able to hear it, perceive it, and then articulate it. So these are called rishis, and they compose the Vedas, the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, the Upanishads, and what have you, Samhitas, etc. And the Vedas teach you how to do ritual, teaches you how to how to meditate, how to contemplate reality like that. And of course, from the Vedas, you can also get certain codes of conduct that are not properly speaking called Shruti, but are cultural ways of articulating what was there in the Vedas. So these are all a given in Indian spirituality, that like most of the schools that are considered orthodox, in that they can be considered Hindu, can all be traced back to the Veda. And schools that are heterodox, like Sikhism, to name a modern one, or Buddhism or Jainism, to name some ancient ones, they're heterodox, not because they're different from all the other schools. They're very similar to all the other schools, actually. They're different, though, in this sense that they don't accept the Vedas as absolutely true. And so you have to ask this question whenever you look at schools of Indian philosophy, and Kolinma, you might know about this because you're in like teacher training and stuff, but you'll see like whenever you see a map of the schools of Indian philosophy or Hindu philosophy, you'll see it's usually rare that you'll see Tantra in that list. You know, it's like first you'll see maybe, probably you'll start with Nyaya or Vaisheshika. So we have these two, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, and then Sankhya, then Yoga. So these are related schools, Nyaya and Vaisheshika. Sometimes it's just Nyaya hyphen Vaisheshika, and then Sankhya and Yoga. And then also, of course, Purva Mimamsa, which means the reverential reading of the Vedas as per the ritual portion, and Uttara Mimamsa, otherwise known as Vedanta, which is the study of the Vedas focusing on the Upanishad, or the philosophical Gnostic portion. So these are the 6 schools of orthodox Hindu philosophy, but you don't see Tantra listed in that. Because in one sense, Tantra has a different set of authoritative scriptures. But unlike Buddhism or unlike Jainism, Tantra in the Hindu sense makes an effort to say that these are just the Vedas presented anew. I mean, they're not necessarily. Like, they're a wholly different set of texts. They're called the Agamas, the Tantras. But they make constant references to the Vedas. They use mantras that are there in the Vedas. And they make claims like, hey, look, in the Yajur Veda, you have 100 names of Shiva. These are the names that we're going to use in this Tantra. So there are Tantras like the Mrigendra Agama, for instance, which reproduce almost verbatim these passages that appear in the Vedas. Like the early masters of the non-dual, sorry, not non-dual, but the early masters of the dualistic and qualified non-dualistic Shaiva traditions were using mantras from the Vedas, and they were brahmanas that existed within Vedic society, you know. So the 5 Shiva mantras, like Tat Purushaya Vidmahe Mahadevaya Dhimahi, these are the tantric mantras that they were using in the early parts of our tantric history. So I think the idea of Tantra being a standalone tradition is very problematic, because there's Buddhist forms of Tantra, there are Jain forms of Tantra, there's like Vaishnava and Shakta and Shaiva forms of Tantra. But like you can see that within the Shaiva, Shakta, Vaishnava tantric world, there is an effort, undeniably, to link the tantras to the Vedas. You know, whereas that effort is not altogether present in the Buddhist tantras. Buddhist tantras don't need to like find legitimacy in the Vedas, because they've rejected the Vedas outright. The Vedas are not an authority to the Buddhist practitioner, and so why should their tantras reflect Vedic ideas? there are still Vedic mantras in the Buddhist tantras, but the Buddhist tantras aren't necessarily interested in proving that they are part of the Vedic stream, And neither are the Jain tantras interested in proving that they are part of the Vedic stream. But the Shaiva tantras, the Shākta tantras, insofar as you can consider them separate tantras, I don't, they will all make claims that they're part of the Vedic stream. Maybe to gain legitimacy, who knows? There definitely were some who you might say were certainly stepping out of the Vedic tradition because they were starting to reject norms that would be very important for Brahmanas, like caste. This was something that these masters were trying to reject, but that would have been important to the Brahmanic society at that time. So the fact that Brahmanas within Vedic society were transgressing purity rules, dismissing the ideas of caste like that, that shows you that maybe they were stepping out of the Vedic stream, but they never understood themselves as doing that. They always felt like this was the deeper revelation of the Vedas. So the argument that we make here, this is a very interesting argument, is that Lord Shiva himself, and remember, this is Shaivism, so its central deity is Shiva. And Shiva himself takes a form, an avatara, if you will, an incarnation. This is Karuna Avatara, out of compassion, like to teach us the true import of the Vedas, the true essential teaching of the Vedas. Lord Shiva becomes, and I'll show you over here, he takes two incarnations. The first one is called Swachanda Nata. And Swachanda Nata is Shiva, but incarnated in the Satya Yuga to reveal the agamas with his 5 heads. Panchabhaktrebhya agamat. The agamas or the tantras are the revelations that come from the 5 heads of Lord Shiva. We talked a lot about this last week. The Pashupati Shiva or the Sada Shiva, the one with 5 heads. This is that guy. So Swachanda Nata is an avatar actually of Shiva in the Satya Yuga who reveals the agama with his 5 heads. By the way, this narrative is offered by Abhinava Gupta, it's offered by Kshema Raja, it's even offered I think by Somānanda in some places. So it's a narrative that Somānanda himself offers as a what do you call it? What's the word for it? It's like the very end, it's like an epilogue or something. He just adds it on to the end of his text. So he gives us, Somānanda gives us his autobiography, if you will, and he mentions things like this. But then something happens. Everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. So then a period of time, addendum I guess you could say, a period of time came when humans became dumb as shit. Like that's just, like some tamas, like some darkness overcame us, and then we just became so stupid. Like we didn't have the refinement of the intellect anymore to be able to understand the import of the Vedas. So taking pity on us fools, Lord Shiva comes again, this time as Shri Kantanatha. So this is like another avatara, because humans have become like so dense at this point, just because tamas or dumbass, like overcome with the tamasic force. But like now, humans are no longer able to understand the Vedas, and they're fucking stuff up, and they're like misunderstanding, and as Mark Twain so acutely and astutely points out, it's not what we know that gets us into trouble, it's what we don't know. It's not what we don't know that gets us into trouble. It's what we know that just ain't so. Like that. So it's not, the problem with the Vedas is that there are misunderstandings, half understandings. And so Lord Shiva comes again as Sri Kantanatha, and he reveals it again. So he already revealed it in the Satya Yuga. With his 5 heads, he's given the Tantras, he's given the Agamas. Which is very interesting, because this shows you that Tantra is not merely a Satya Yuga a Kali Yuga philosophy, as some propose. It's a timeless revelation of Lord Shiva. It's the Vedas. And by Vedas, no books are meant. So it's timelessly available. Lord Shiva is always timelessly revealing the 5 agamas, or the various agamas, innumerable agamas with his 5 heads. But in this Kali Yuga, Shiva takes an additional avatara to help us understand those agamas, those tantras. So there's this irascible sage. His name is Durvasas. He appears all over the Puranas as a kind of like irritable, irascible kind of sage. And he's doing practices. Somānanda calls him Urdhva Retas. He gives him a title, meaning one who has redirected the flow of his semen up into the brain. So he's a master yogi, that idea. So Durvasas is at the top of the mountains, wandering about the Himalayas like that, maybe in Mount Kailash, who knows. And Urdhva Reta, he's like mastered his semen, he's mastered his energy, something like that. And so Sri Kanta comes to him and implores him to help out. He's like, look, these people, dumbasses. You need to do something about it. You're like the best of them. I'm going to reveal to you these teachings. Again, I've already revealed them, but now I'm going to reveal them in a way that's going to make sense to everybody. It's going to be really helpful to them. And it's your job to propagate these teachings. In other words, to bring a renaissance of the tantras, to restore the dharma, to bring balance to the force. Yada yada hi dharmasya. So, Durvasas agrees, and he gets this download from Lord Shiva. And then, in order to propagate the teaching, remember, Durvasas is an urdhva reta, meaning he has this kind of yogic power. He doesn't need to copulate in order to have children. He can just will children into existence. Manasa putras, they're called, mind-born children. So he just imagines and projects, and he's a master manifester, to use modern terms. And so he projects into existence 3 children, and you can see their names are all over here. Let me share the screen again with you. So here are their names. Amardaka. And to Amardaka, Sri Kantanatha teaches duality. Then to Sri Natha, he teaches qualified non-duality. And to Triambaka, he teaches non-duality. So there are 3 main teachers here. Amardaka, just ignore the rest of this. But Amardaka learns duality, the reality of Shiva in a dual form. This guy, Sri Natha, another son of Durvasas, learns qualified non-duality, and Triambaka, who is the person of interest today, is the one to whom Durvasas gave Advaita, non-duality. And these are 3 mind-born children. Now, arguably, there's a 4th, and the 4th is the daughter of Triambaka. And the daughter of Triambaka is also mind-born, and she teaches the Kaula. So you could say there are 4 primordial schools of Tantra. Dualistic Tantra, captured by the 10 Shaiva agamas, the 10 kind of foundational dualistic agamas. This qualified non-duality captured by the 18 Raudra agamas, which are dual and non-dual. And finally the 64 Bhairava agamas, which were taught to Triambaka. So altogether you have 10 plus 18 plus 64. What does that give you, like 91, 92 or something like that? You do the math, but 10 plus 18 plus 64. These are the total number of agamas revealed. 10 to Amardaka, the dual agamas, 18 to Srinatha, the qualified non-dual agamas, and 64 to Triambaka. So there are like at least 92 agamas. There are actually, in truth, many more than this, but this is the story. Like in the legend, there are like 92 agamas. Okay, now I'm going to focus a bit on Triambaka. Actually, just en passant, let me say something about Amardaka. His disciple was Eraka, whose Krama Stotram actually we have. So this Eraka composed a Krama Stotram, which we looked at here one time in our class. Then his disciple was Vamanatha, and Vamanatha's disciple was Abhinava Gupta. So Abhinava Gupta actually inherits dualistic Shaivism from Amardaka through Eraka and Vamanatha, according to legend. So this is one lineage. But I want to focus now on this lineage, Triambaka's lineage, because it's maybe the most relevant to us. So Triambaka, the very name, refers to 3 eyes. And you might remember, Om Triambakam Yajamahe. It's that same idea that he's got 3 eyes. His 3rd eye is the non-dual eye. So the 3rd eye resolves the duality of the first 2 eyes, like that. So he learns non-duality. He has a daughter who teaches Kaula. We won't talk about her right now. It's for another night. But here, Triambaka also projects a mind-born son named Triambakaditya. So this is Triambakam's son, but mentally born. Triambakaditya. But then Triambakaditya also creates another mentally born son. And then that son also creates another mentally born son. And they're all siddhas, meaning fully perfected beings from their very inception. So there are 14 of them. The 15th one fell in love with a Brahmana, a beautiful and young Brahmin woman. And so the 15th one did not create a mind-born child. In fact, he met this Brahmin woman and married her, asked for her hand in marriage. And his name was Sangam Aditya, which is very interesting because Sangam means, need I say more? But Sangam Aditya, then he had a son, and this was the first son who was born of a womb in this lineage. Remember, Triambaka was not born of a womb. Triambaka was born of Durvasas's mind, and so too with like 15 sons. But the 15th son married a woman, and this is not considered a problem. It just happened. It's not like, oh my God, the line was broken. It was not. It was still continuing, no problem. So his name is Sangam Aditya, and then his son, who was born of a womb, is named Vrishaditya, and then his son was Arunaditya, and it could have been Arunaditya or I forget right now, but one of them moved to Kashmir. So arguably all of this was happening outside of Kashmir. Durvasas might have been up in the Himalayas, who knows where he was when he received this revelation from Lord Shiva. Then the name Triambaka suggests that maybe this man was somewhere in Maharashtra, because there is a Triambakeshwara temple there. Maybe his name is somewhat associated to that. Scholars can speculate. I heard one very good scholar who I respect and trust the other day at a temple say to me that he thinks that Machanda was a king of the Deccan plains. So the Deccan is one region in India. It's a very important region. It stretches all the way into South India, and it's there in West India like that. And in the Deccan, a lot of Tantra was developed. And you can like just Google it, the Deccan, not right now, but later you can see there's a region in India, Deccan. And in this region called the Deccan, you get rich Tantric materials. And maybe Triambaka was from the Deccan. Who knows? Maybe he just was in the mountain the whole time. There's another story, I think even in Somānanda you get this idea that the 15 sons never left the mountain. Maybe the mountain is like a loka. Maybe it's like a mythological landscape, who knows. But these 15 sons are like there in the mountain. It's only Sangamaditya, the 18th son, who like maybe comes down the mountain or something like that. He comes down and then he re-engages in society. And so eventually one of the members of this lineage moves to Kashmir. I forget which one. Maybe it's Arunaditya. Anyway, don't quote me on that. I don't remember just now. But either Arunaditya or Ananda, I think, comes to Kashmir. Anyway, Ananda is the father of our Somānanda. So Somānanda is by birth part of the lineage that can be traced back to Triambaka himself, who received this teaching from his father Durvasas, who got it from Shiva direct. Okay, that's a very important point, because that means Somānanda, by birth actually, by birthright even, is the inheritor of what we call the Trika, or the non-dual school of the Trika. Okay, so I think Triambaka being a very important figure of non-dual Shaivism, it's important to remember that Somānanda can trace his lineage back to Triambaka. So it's argued that Somānanda is part of a lineage, and like there's Vasugupta and Kalata Bhatta, but it's also argued that he's a founder of this is a whole other lineage coming straight from Shiva. Now his disciple is named Utpaladeva, who is perhaps one of the most important names in the non-dual Shaiva world, because he composes some very important texts like Ishvara Pratya Bhigya Karika, among others. Utpala's Deva's disciple is Lakshmana Gupta, who didn't produce any text, or whose text didn't survive. But his disciple is Abhinava Gupta. So that's this lineage. Somānanda Natha, his disciple is Utpala Deva, whose disciple is Lakshmana Gupta, whose disciple is Abhinava Gupta, whose disciple is like Shema Raja and then Yoga Raja, and you can add Jairata there and all that. So like this is the non-dual tantric lineage. But just I want to make a point about this right now. The first point I want to make about the kind of philosophies that we're studying here. So again, I should have mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, but last week we were talking a little bit about spiritual power, how to generate spiritual power, and things that can cause you to lose spiritual power. And we argued, based on that reading from the complete works of Swami Vivekananda, that like sectarianism or like condescension, feeling like your philosophy is the only philosophy, it's the best philosophy and everyone else is wrong, that can sap you of power. You know, and then this kind of gossiping and backbiting that naturally comes about as a result of thinking you alone are right and everyone else is wrong, this thing can sap spiritual power. And the reason why we think our philosophy is right is because on some level subconsciously, we are all committed to the idea that if X is right, Y must be wrong. And if Y is right, Z must be wrong. How can X, Y, and Z all be true at the same time if they are all contradicting one another? So we all of us have to admit that on some level, we have this kind of assumption that if things contradict, they can't all be true. Right? If somebody says X and somebody says not X, one of them is lying. Which one? Right? That's the assumption that we bring with us into the study of philosophy and religion. But like, I just want you to notice what happened here in this story. Lord Shiva comes and he gives 3 revelations. This is very important. He doesn't just teach Advaita and the other 2 get it wrong and they're like heretics. You know, he teaches 3 distinct revelations to 3 distinct students who he then charges with the work of propagating that particular school which was given unto them. So the point here that we're trying to make is that Shiva himself feels like these are 3 valid readings of the ultimate reality. As Acharyaji Staneshwar Timalsana says so beautifully, he says, if you say Advaita alone is right and everyone else is wrong, just think about what you're saying for a moment. You're saying Shiva tells the truth with one of his heads and he lies with his other 4. You know, like that can't be it. Like, why would he do that? You could say, oh, just for the plot or something like that. But no, I think axiomatically, Shaivas, they won't accept that Shiva's lying to you. Like, they'll rather theologically say, if Shiva said these 3 agamas, they're all equally authoritative because they're all equally from Shiva. So why can't Shiva have three ways of looking at reality? Why can't we have more than one way of looking at reality? And why can't all of these be valid? So the first point I want to make, which will come back later, by the way, all of this, like this sounds kind of like basic, you know this stuff, but it's going to come back later in this talk in a very, I think, philosophically subtle way that ultimately will be why I'll make a case for why we should never gossip or find fault, but you'll see that this isn't just a moral teaching, it isn't just a pragmatic teaching, it's a metaphysical ontological teaching, and I'll come to it in a moment. But for now, it's enough to make this point, that according to this story, there are at least three ways of seeing reality. And Swami Vivekananda will use these three ways to categorize different kinds of religions in the world. So these three are dualistically, qualified non-dualistically, and non-dualistically. These are the three kinds of religions there are in the world. Most of religions, I think, are dualistic, but there are many non-dualistic religions. In any case, they're not one right and everyone else is wrong. They're all right. Everything is all right, actually. Now continuing, and you'll see how this comes back in a very cool way. But now continuing. Oh, by the way, just for fun, if you want to know about these yugas, like your Satya Yuga and Kali Yuga and all that, just for fun. Okay, so this Divya Mana is called a divine year. And so I think it's like 12, what is it? Is it 360 years, human years makes one divine year or something like that, I think? I forget exactly. But 4,800 divine years gives you 1728000 years. Bye, Colleen. But like, I don't know, what is it? Is it times 30 or something? Or I don't know. But 4,800 times 30, I guess, gives you 360, sorry, times 360, I think, gives you 1,728. Again, my math is not the best. But Satya Yuga lasts for this long. And then Treta Yuga lasts for this long. And then Dwapara Yuga lasts for this long. And then Kali Yuga lasts for this long. So notice, they all become less and less and less and less. So the Kali Yuga is the shortest. And then all of this together, which is 12,000 Divyamanas, which is 4.320000 years, this whole thing is called one Chatur Yuga, meaning one set of 4 yugas. So one complete cycle of all the yugas equals one Chatur Yuga. 71 of these Chatur Yugas gives us one Manvantara. Those of you studying the Chandi, you might have seen that like the ruler became a ruler of a Manvantara, like that. So these categories of time are mentioned. And 14 Manvantaras gives us one Kalpa. And Kalpa means like aeon. But one aeon is one day in the life of Brahma. And Brahma, his entire or what is it? Like, what is this? His entire lifespan is like 4.32 billion years, I think, or something. Or maybe one day, I forget. But this is roughly the age of the universe, right? 4.5 billion years or something. It's like rough, it tallies with modern astronomical projections for how old our universe is. So 100 years of Brahma, which is equal to 36,000 days of Brahma, is one para, which is 311.04 trillion years. So this is the lifespan of the entire universe. I think, okay, I'm sorry, this is the life of our Earth, right? Our Earth is 4.5 billion years, if I'm not mistaken. Right? I think there's some astronomical figure that 4.5 billion years old. I think it's our Earth. Our Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And that's one day for Brahma, which is 14 Manvantaras, which is 71 Chatur Yugas times 14, like that. So you can see. So anyway, in the 100 years of Brahma, this is about 311.04 trillion years, which is the lifespan of the entire universe. At the end of 311.04 trillion years like that, like what happens is Brahma dies. Like after 100 years, he dies. Like he's born. In his mind, the universe is born, maintained. And when he dies, the universe is dissolved. So the entire universe exists within Brahma. And Brahma is a temporal being, and he dies and he comes back. And he doesn't really die, I guess. He is withdrawn and then reprojected and withdrawn and then reprojected. And allegedly, we are currently in the 28th Kali Yuga, which began on midnight between the 17th and 18th February by Julian or 23rd January by Gregorian in 3102 BCE. So this is when our current Kali Yuga started, according to some estimates, in the 7th Manvantara on the first day of the second half of Brahma's lifespan. I just wanted to throw this in here just to give you a sense of like the time scales we're talking about. This alone is quite profound. But now something else I want to make mention of here is that when you think about these time scales, you'll have to realize the smallest unit of time in Indian temporality is the breath. It's called a prana. So you can actually change time by changing the breath. This is a very important point. In the West, we have things like clocks and stuff like that, so it's very fixed. But time is more fluid. It's a kind of mental experience that's subjective to the experiencer in this philosophy. So you could actually inhale and exhale one whole day of Brahma. The whole thing can happen within a breath. But of course, because we breathe in a particular way, we experience time in a particular way. Like we experience like 24 minutes and like this, 24 minutes and then 48 minutes. Like there's all these different measurements. But allegedly, we have about 30 days in a month and 12 months in a year, like that. So the way these things actually end up being experienced is based on how we breathe. So mastery over the breath, the tradition argues, is also mastery over time. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I just wanted to offer that piece because, we're talking about Kali Yuga, Satya Yuga. But in another sense, Satya Yuga is happening at the same time as Kali Yuga. Like right now, in this moment, encoded into your very breath, Lord Shiva with his 5 heads is teaching the Agamas. Right? Like that's the idea that like thus far I've been giving a story, and this story sounds like a chronological event. It's like, oh, this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. But I just want to challenge that idea for you for a moment. It's not like this is happening in a sequence. Maybe it's happening in a logical sequence, not necessarily a temporal sequence. The point I want to make now is it's all happening all together at once. That Lord Shiva with his 5 heads is revealing the Agama. That's happening now, in this very moment, within this breath, actually. That's why the Agamas are always available. So we can think of all of this historically, but we can also think of it more mystically. Having said all of that, though, there are some texts that existed maybe before 800 CE, and these are the early Trika texts. So like texts like the Siddha Yogeshwari Mata, Siddha Yogeshwari Mata Tantra. Of course, the Malini Vijayotaro Tantra, which is so important. That's Abhinava Gupta's whole thing. And the Tantra Sadbhava Tantra. These are like Trika texts, you could say. And they existed in India way before Somānanda, way before Vasugupta, like that. Like they were already present. Then you have texts like Kali texts, and this is somewhere between maybe 800 and 900 CE. Texts like the Devya Yamala Tantra, which is lost, the Jayadratha Yamala Tantra, Trika Sadbhava, Trika Hridaya, Trishuro Bhairava Tantra. Like there are these tantras. So these are called tantras, meaning they are all primary revelations of Lord Shiva. Whereas what Somānanda is doing is interesting. He is describing the worldview that one attains as a result of properly studying, practicing, and mastering the tantras. So his work can be called exegesis, meaning explanation, or his work can be called post-scriptural, in that it attempts to make known to us what is otherwise only implied. It's an attempt to make explicit what is only implicit in the tantras. It's an attempt to like explain the ritual significance of the tantras. In a sense, when we meet on Thursday evenings and we do our puja class, that's the same thing. It's exegesis. We take a tantra and we explain the rituals. Like, why do we say this mantra? Why do we do this mudra? Like, what's the soteriological significance of this? What's the metaphysic here? What's the ontology? Like that. This is called exegesis. And this is the job of a teacher, to take something, a primary source that was revealed by Lord Shiva, and to interpret it so that we can understand it in our own words, in our own way. So these are great teachers, right? Somānanda is a great teacher who is a master, and his work, Shiva Drishti, in 7 books, is, you could argue, like an explanation of all the tantric texts I mentioned, like the Siddha Yogeshwari Mata Tantra, the Malini Vijayotaro Tantra, the Tantra Sadbhava. Like these are all various tantras like that you could say already taught this stuff, but it isn't until Somānanda offers it in this philosophical way that we can kind of understand it as a standalone school of philosophy. And remember, all schools of philosophies are darshanas, meaning direct revelations of truth. Okay, so that's all preamble. Now we know who Somānanda is. He lived between like 900 and 950 AD. He was quite critical of the kings of his time because he sometimes makes sort of like passing remarks about corrupt kings. Before him, there was the rule of a king, Avanti Varman, which was a very, very prosperous time for Kashmir and a very stable time for Kashmir. So you could see there was like a flowering of philosophy occurring in this region because of the state patronage. But during Somānanda's time, things were actually, it got a bit dicey. There was no ruler who was able to keep power for too long. There was always a kind of constant change of regime. So like our current times, of course, like this is almost always true in history, Somānanda was living and writing and thinking and practicing in political turmoil, in politically ambiguous and difficult times. So it's a really remarkable thing that the work of such brilliance, this level of spiritual perfection, can arise in a time of such political instability. That's another interesting point to make about Somānanda. He was probably patronized by whichever king was in office at that time. So he was a Shri Bhatta, meaning his title conferred to him meant that he was a court Brahmin. he was a scholar of a very high status. He was part of the upper echelons of the elite academic circles of Kashmir. Like how Abhinava Gupta and Shaiva Raja after him would be called Rajanaka, meaning sponsored by the king. So too was Somānanda, Shri Bhatta Somānanda, the auspicious teacher Somānanda. It's a title conferred upon him by the king. So we have to understand that this is a person who was involved in the court, who was very high up there in the upper echelons of like Kashmiri Brahmins, but also he was critical of the court and somewhat aloof of the court. And his vision is somewhat eccentric, so eccentric that historically we've kind of forgotten it almost even. In fact, it's eclipsed by his disciple Utpaladeva, as the scholar Nanak points out. It's like we don't know about Somānanda because he's overcoded, maybe even inadvertently, by his somewhat more famous student Utpaladeva. And so much so that we think that what Somānanda said is just what Utpala said. But the important thing is that the disciple Utpala, although he tries his best to remain faithful to his teacher, has his own vision of reality. And it's a bit different, and dare I say, much less radical than Somānanda's. Somānanda's might be the most radical version of Advaita that I have yet to come across. I mean, the radical can be defined in different ways, but I'm going to use the word radical here in the idea of like most inclusive and maybe even most shocking, and dare I say from a spiritual religious point of view, maybe even most disturbing. But also, for the right kind of person, the most thrilling, the most freeing. Just to hear it once, one just wants to laugh. Okay, so now let's get into the view. So again, one day, and I'll just finish up soon, but one day we'll like unpack it properly, we'll go over it together. This is just a bit of an introduction to a view. The reason why I wanted to talk about it today was because it will have something to do with Ambuvachi, as you'll see in just a few moments. It will also have something to do with the new moon, and of course also Shivaratri. Tonight's Shivaratri, so I thought on this Monday, it's very, very special when Shivaratri falls on a Monday, I would just think about my favorite Shaiva masters. And Somānanda, although I don't quite mention him quite as much, just maybe out of reverence and respect, out of fear that I might misunderstand him or something, I think it'd be fair to say that my view and the kind of philosophy that I present, it's best represented by Somānanda, as opposed to like maybe the other authors of the tradition. Because Somānanda expresses this kind of non-duality. And let's just talk about what kind of non-duality that is. So, the ultimate nature of reality, you can call it Shiva or Kali or whatever you want. It doesn't matter. But there is this ultimate nature of reality. And you can call it God if you want. And now, the argument here is that only this reality exists. Nothing apart from this reality exists. So this is the basic axiom of this philosophy. It's called Advaita, meaning no second reality. Advaita, no second reality apart from this reality exists. That's why it doesn't matter what you call it. You can call it Kali, you can call it Brahman, you can call it Shiva, but you must start with this axiom. And it's not an axiom, it's a religious revelation, that one reality alone exists. Now, what is that reality? You can accept this axiomatically, it's consciousness, but you can also experientially verify this for yourself. The one inalienable aspect of every experience, the unitive factor that can be found in and through all experience, is the fact of your consciousness. I am conscious, and that's one thing I cannot deny, for to deny it would be to presuppose it. You see, to deny it would be an act of consciousness affirming itself. You can try. I don't exist. That very statement occurred in consciousness as an act of consciousness. So, I'm choosing these words very carefully. Act of consciousness. Notice what consciousness does. Again, I'm using these words very, very carefully. Consciousness experiences. It knows. That's the basic thing. It's a cognizing sort of faculty. Like either it knows certain thoughts or emotions, or it knows certain sensations, or it knows that it doesn't know. So like if I'm going to drink this, so I have two bottles of water here. One is a fancier bottle of water and one is a more generic bottle of water, So some people would drink one bottle of water and be like, this one tastes like this. So consciousness knows. And then I drink the other bottle of water, like this one tastes like this. They have a different taste actually between them. Okay, but then the next question you might ask me is which one is better? And I might say, I don't know. I don't know which one is better because I don't know what makes one better. And then you might say, well, which one do you like? And I'll say, I like this one or something. Now, I know all of that. I know what I don't know. I know what I do know. I'm aware of my preferences, which are subtle movements within my psyche, but I'm also aware of what seem to be grosser experiences like the actual physical taste of the water. Notice this is what consciousness does. It cognizes. It knows emotions, thoughts, sensations, etc. But it also knows when it doesn't know. So if you ask me what's happening in the hotel room next door, don't know, don't want to know. But I don't know, you see, and I know that I don't know. That's also an act of consciousness, knowing. But that's not all that consciousness does. When consciousness knows something, the next thing that typically follows is some kind of action. So for instance, if I know that I prefer this bottle over this bottle, I might choose to drink out of this one instead. Or if I know that I'm thirsty, and if I know that water quenches thirst, then I will drink water. The relationship here is very important between knowing something and acting. So because of knowledge, action is possible. Through knowledge, you can call it even heyo padeya nishchaya, to use a phrase from Abhinava Gupta, the knowledge of what is to be kept close and the knowledge of what is to be cast away. That kind of discernment usually will precede action. And if I know what is to be kept close, I will act in order to bring it into my life. And if I know what is to be pushed away, I will act to push it away from my life. Notice this is true of literally every conscious being in the universe, no? Every being on some level knows what's worth moving towards and knows what's worth moving away from. And based on this knowing, it then acts. So notice this action, where is it happening? In consciousness. It's in consciousness that I cognize what I want and cognize what I don't want. And it's in consciousness that I act to get what I want and minimize what I don't want. Do you see? And this is basic to literally every living thing, from like a microcellular organism to Brahma, the creator God. So the whole range of being, from the lowliest, minutest kind of insectoid being to, or like a blade of grass. Often in Sanskrit, literature, they use this like blade of grass all the way to Brahma, just to describe the whole range of beings. So from the blade of grass all the way to Brahma, all these beings share something in common. They know and they act. Brahman knows that it would be good to create a world, so he does so. You know, the kind of world he creates is also a knowledge and action kind of thing. Similarly, the microorganism knows when it needs to eat food, and then it moves towards that food, right? It knows when it wants to reproduce and moves towards its, I don't know, most of these are like asexually reproducing anyway, but it doesn't act based on the knowledge. Okay, so basically what we've established is a common feature that inheres in all things. Now, when we go to Buddhism, Vijnanavada Buddhism, the claim is already made that everything is occurring within consciousness. Everything shares this in common. It's held within consciousness as consciousness. Kav, I'm so excited to see you soon. Actually, Viranatha is on the bus right now. I was just with him a moment ago. Then we said farewell. Tomorrow, hopefully, Kavindra will see you. But anyway, there's Viranatha in the bus. Sucks, bro. Like, I had to go so soon. But anyway, I'm glad you found a bus tonight. You know, bus 108, no less. But anyway, so hopefully this is very dry philosophy sometimes. Hopefully this will put you to sleep in the bus. But this idea that there are some things in this universe that I don't know. And there are some things that I do know, but they're all held within consciousness. This is an idea that's there in Vijnanavada also. The doctrine of Vijnana, consciousness. It's a Buddhist school. You know, later it will be proved that there's no mind also. But there's chitta matra, mind only. The idea is that like everything that is in consciousness. This is what everything has in common. Try and see. Try if you can locate one thing outside of consciousness. Have you been able to do it thus far? No, because the moment you point to it, it's within consciousness. And if you propose something beyond consciousness, and think about what you're saying, it's not that it's beyond knowledge. Lots of things can be beyond knowledge, but not be beyond consciousness. Lots of things can be beyond perception, but not be beyond consciousness. But if there is something beyond consciousness, then notice, Natalie, it's so good to see you, Jaima. Notice what you've said is that something exists that you cannot prove. And cannot even in principle prove. Why even posit its existence? Nothing exists apart from consciousness, and even if something exists apart from consciousness, what's it to you? You can't verify it anyway. You know, it's not a figure of language even. It's not something that's worth philosophizing about, because it's not anything that you will ever encounter. So everything you have ever encountered, and likely all there is within consciousness. Right? That's a thrilling thought. That you've never once encountered this universe apart from your conscious perception of it. And perhaps there does not exist a universe independently, objectively, apart from your perception of it. So this already can give you a lot of freedom because it shows you that the kind of person you are will naturally influence the kind of universe you get, since the universe exists only in your perception of it. So in one sense, changing your perception can change the universe, but this is not as simple as it sounds because this patterning occurs in a place much deeper than the conscious mind. That's why you can't just turn on the news and will it not to be true. You can turn off the TV, but maybe if you try to will like a war to stop or something, you might find that it doesn't happen. But actually, we're arguing that actually it's happening on some deep level of patterning. Rose, Jaima, Jaima. Like, yeah, like what, why do I see this world? Because the way that I am. The world is as I am. And this is a very important doctrine in the Vijnanavada teaching. Like in the Buddhist Vijnanavada, the argument is that, and this is also true of Advaita Vedanta, the argument is that I'm projecting. Like to use a psychological term also, I'm reading into what you're saying, what you're not actually saying, by virtue of my own needs and fears. In other words, Ma is saying something to me, but she means one thing and I take her to mean something else because of my projection. And so you can even go further. There are some schools of Advaita which would say it's only a projection. It's not a false reading of something real, it's just false. And that's what Buddhism ultimately will argue. It's not a false reading of a real reality, the way Advaita Vedanta will phrase it. They're ultimately saying the same things with different kind of stress points, but this is false. Like what I'm projecting is false. That's one way of understanding it. Mithyavada, it's called. I don't know what I'm seeing because I'm putting in the place of reality something unreal. This is my projection. I use my language and my precognitive kind of pre-discursive conditioning to kind of do this sort of conditioning. Okay, having said that, the first point to make from Vijnanavada is that everything that is in consciousness. Now, what Utpala Deva, sorry, what Somānanda adds, I think is brilliant. It's so profound. This vision is so profound. It's like, and what is that consciousness? So if everything is within consciousness, what else is common to everything? And then the argument is, well, all sentient beings, they know and they do. So there is something called jnana, knowledge, and there's something called kriya, action, that is common to all sentient beings. Okay. Now, these are called Shaktis. So, Somananda might be the one who firmly establishes what later in the tradition, or maybe what we can call in the tradition, even at his time, the Shakti Traya, which means the triplicity of Shaktis, the three Shaktis. And thus we've already identified two. Jnana Shakti, the power of knowing. And by power here, Shakti, we can mean function or faculty. So consciousness is that which knows, which cognizes. This is called Jnana Shakti. But it's also that which acts. Because everything that happens within consciousness, and so that action is also happening within consciousness. So this is called Kriya Shakti, Jnana Shakti and Kriya Shakti. And now this is where it gets really interesting. Arguably, Somananda puts an emphasis on this even more prior Shakti. It's called Icha Shakti. Icha means will or desire. So to know requires a kind of desire. I have to desire in order to know. And not only that, to act requires a kind of desire. So now this idea of desire is built into consciousness. This is where Somananda gets incredibly subtle, and it will, I think, take some time to fully unpack this, and I mean to soon. And he's saying that actually consciousness has two aspects. One is called nirvritti, meaning without movement, and the other is called aunmukhya. There are two parts of a process, nirvritti and aunmukhya. Aunmukhya means something like inward facing or something like that, but I think it can best be translated as urge, a kind of urge, like a pre-cognitive even, pre-active throb, like spanda, like that's another word we can use. But it's a kind of, how to say, like own mukhya, like what word in English would you use to describe this? A kind of tremor, a thrill, a sort of anticipating sort of feeling, like I want to do something, that feeling of like I desire to know. Haven't you felt that? Like say you forgot a word, like you're like say okay somebody brings up a subject and there's like a word that you're looking for and you're trying to think about it, you want to know it, and then you remember marzipan. It's from a Ben Stiller movie I like, but like suddenly it comes, you remember it, but that moment right before you knew it, yes, I think Krameshri, that's right, urge, right? Like it's like this urge to know, and then not only that, this urge to do. Just isolate that for a moment. Because sometimes we can't really isolate the urge for the action from the action. We can't really distinguish the urge to know from knowing. But what Somānanda seems to be pointing out here is that there is something inherent to consciousness that is prior even to knowing, prior even to doing. It's that urge to know, that urge to do. And this is called itcha, desire. So now we start to articulate a philosophy of desire that there is built into consciousness, and this is unique, I think, to Somananda, this idea of desire. That consciousness desires. And what does it desire to do? It desires to know and it desires to do. These are actions. Okay, so desiring, Icha Shakti is the primal Shakti. And so you have three: Icha Shakti, Jnana Shakti, and Kriya Shakti. These three Shaktis. They're called the Shakti Traya, the three Shaktis that inhere in consciousness, insofar as all conscious beings, this is the key, demonstrate the urge to know and to do. All beings will. I think that's another way to translate this word will, although that takes us into kind of like Kant territory and whatnot, or Nietzsche territory. But this like will to know and to do is itself a power. It's not a will to power, as Nietzsche might say. It's the power of willing that takes us into some cognition or takes into some action. So you can think of these as a sequence, but they're not really a sequence. The three are all part of one process. To will is to know is to do. What is consciousness? It's a willing, knowing, doing reality. And by the way, if you want to be even more like austere with this philosophy, you could say at the very least, consciousness is conscious. Consciousness knows itself in one sense. Can you imagine being but not being aware? It would be ridiculous. And can you imagine being aware and not being? No, your very being is inextricable from your awareness. I am because I am aware, and I am aware because I am. So I am is to be aware, and to be aware is to be. Do you see the point here is that if I am aware, I know that I am aware. Immediately, non-discursively, non-analytically, a priori, I know that I am, just by virtue of knowing. So it's built into consciousness to be self-aware. Is that not a kind of cognition? We can call it swa-anubhutam, meaning swa-anubhavana, or swa means self, anubhava means experience. So swa-anubhava means or bhutam ekam anayam, the idea that I know by means of my knowing. It's immediately precognitively obvious, indubitable even, that I am. So knowing knows itself. This sounds very technical, but it's so important because it's true. You just feel it right now. You know because you know. How do you know that you are? Just ask yourself. It's a silly question. The very fact that I know is itself justification. The knowing itself is proof. Let me put it another way. What do I need to see in order to know that I have eyes? What specific thing would I have to see in order to prove to myself that I have eyeballs that work? What do you think? Does anybody want to take a pass at this? This, I think, is a very stunning and important realization. What particularly in this world do I need to see in order to be able to prove to myself that I can see? And that's a good point. Without light, I might not be able to see. And these are all very interesting. If I look at water, if I look at a mirror, if I look at light. But I think Viranatha is on the money here. Literally anything. Nothing specific. Exactly, Rose. Nothing specific. I don't have to see anything specific to know that I'm seeing. Anything that I see is already proof that I'm seeing. Even darkness. If I see darkness, the fact that I'm not seeing light is itself proof that I'm seeing. Yeah, if I can see, as Natalie points out, then I have eyes. And I think both Natalies are here today, so I'm happy. Bristol Natalie and Las Vegas Natalie. I've missed you both so much. This idea that if I see anything, literally anything whatsoever at all, then that's already proof that I'm seeing. Okay, now check this out. If I'm conscious of literally anything, that's already proof that I'm conscious. And even when I'm in deep sleep, I'm conscious of that too. Jaiman Natalie. Oh, wow. Hopefully we'll come and see you soon. We're traveling, so be exciting. Now, when is there a time when I'm not conscious? Even in deep sleep, you could say there's some sense in which I slept deeply. Anyway, we don't need to get into that debate right now. But the only thing to point out here is if you want to reject knowing, willing, and doing, you can, but you cannot reject that consciousness is doing something. Haven't you heard Advaita Vedantins tell you that consciousness is sakshi, a witness? Okay, what does a witness do? It witnesses. Isn't witnessing an act? right? Like think about like witnessing itself is an act. So consciousness is active, it is dynamic. This is the basic like 101 of all tantra. The ultimate nature of reality is dynamic. It is a willing, knowing, doing kind of reality. And so if you want a dualistic understanding of this is God. God is that pure consciousness which knows, wills, and does. Or you could say God is that reality which reposes in its own self and filled with the bliss of its own being, wills, knows, and does. And what does it will? Well, all of this. What does it know? All of this. And what does it do? All of this. I was speaking to a pastor today on the New Jersey transit train, very intellectually gifted uh, Catholic priest, and we were having a debate of sorts, and I was debating determinism and free will and whatnot. And he said something so beautiful. He said, because I asked him, what would happen? Is there such a thing as a body without Holy Ghost? Because I was trying to make the claim that every body is Holy Spirit. And Holy Spirit is not something that's in the body. The body is in Holy Spirit. And so we we're having this bit of a debate. And he was like, yeah, if there's no Holy Spirit, and I was trying to like relate Holy Spirit to Kundalini. I'm like, so Holy Spirit, like if it's not in a body, will the heart beat? Will the blood circulate? All of that. And he said, yes, all of that happens. The entire universe happens because God is constantly participating in loving it. If God stops for a moment being aware of the universe or loving the universe, and then I interjected, I said, the heart will stop. And he said, even more than that, you will wink out of existence, which is a beautiful way of putting it. It was very, I never quite heard it that way from a Catholic priest. Gorgeous. So he was saying God so loves the world that the world exists. It's a reflection in God. It was stunning how close that kind of language was to what we talk about sometimes. Anyway, then he said, if God for a moment withdrew his attention or ceased to love the world, and notice how this Catholic pastor was equating the word love and attention, as Eric Fromm would also do later on. So like this idea, love and or earlier on, Eric Fromm did this. So love and attention, the same thing. So if God were to withdraw his love or his attention from the world, it would wink out of existence. Right? That idea. So the very act of witnessing is a kind of creation, you could say. That the very act of knowing, willing, and doing is within consciousness. It's something that God does. God wills and knows and does. And the universe is God's knowing, willing, and doing, you could say. If God stops knowing, the world brings out of existence. If God stops doing, the world brings out of existence. And if God stops willing, which is the point that the pastor was making on the New Jersey transit, if God stops willing, meaning loving, if God stops loving the world, then he won't know and he won't do, and the world will literally wink out of existence in an instant. That was the language that he used. The world would wink out of existence in an instant. Beautiful, profound. I was so moved. And the conversation would have been better, but then the train stopped and then we had to get off. And I was like, damn, it was getting to a good place. I thought I almost proved determinism anyway. So now this is where it gets really interesting. This is the most important thing. If God is consciousness, then in what way is God's consciousness different from my consciousness? And Somānanda says, in no way. This is what makes this a non-dual claim. There is only one reality, and guess what? Sarvam Shivatmakam. You're it, and everything is it, and that means you are everything. This is the stunning claim. There is only one reality called consciousness, and we can, like on another occasion, go into arguments as to why this reality must only be one. And you can come at this from a consciousness only view, or you can come at this from a theological view. If you say God is absolute, then there cannot exist even one thing apart from God. That would be a limit to her absoluteness. If you say God is all powerful, how can there be any energy or agency outside of God? So all that happens within God. It is God. And more importantly, because you are, and you can't doubt that, then you are God. So you can go into this much more, and I will in a future occasion. But the claim is that I am. I can't doubt that I am. God is. And maybe God isn't, but like insofar as you're defining God as consciousness, and insofar as I am essentially consciousness, in what sense then does it make sense to, in how would it make sense to posit that God is a consciousness apart from the consciousness that I am? So Somananda realizes in the Shiva Drishti that this thing that we call Shiva is none other than my very own essence nature. And so look at this opening verse. It's so beautiful how he says in this verse his hymn, his opening hymn to Lord Shiva. It's called the Mangalacharna. And he says here, Asmat Rupa Samavishtaha Swatmanatma Nivarane Shiva Karotu Nijaya Namaha Shaktya Tatatmane. Om Shiva, you have possessed my form by hiding yourself from yourself by means of your own self. I pay to this all, I pay homage, Namah Shivaya, to this all extensive, all pervasive self, which is all pervasive by Shakya, by his own power, Tatatmane, by his own thatness. So, like, the idea is that I am Shiva, and so are you, and everything is Shiva, because only Shiva exists. Shivam Sarvatmakam. But now, this is where the claim gets interesting. You've heard this all before. You've heard everything is Shiva, you've heard Shiva as consciousness, but this is where the claim gets really interesting. Check this out. All conscious beings, of course, all conscious beings are conscious, but all conscious beings will, know, and do, right? Now, does there exist anything outside of consciousness? No. So even the seemingly inanimate objects are in consciousness as consciousness. And if you've already noticed that consciousness is a willing, knowing, and doing reality, then literally every object, even inanimate ones, will know and act. So that means your coffee mug, to cite a famous philosophical paper, is not only conscious, it's willing, knowing, and doing. It wills to be a coffee mug. It knows that it's a coffee mug. And it like acts like a coffee mug. Yeah. Right? The claim here is that there's no such thing as jaratva, inanimateness. Jara means inanimate, twa means ness. So like there's no such thing as insentiency. If you ask Somānanda, is AI conscious? He'll say, yes, yes, absolutely, 100%, fuck yes. The AI is conscious. But if you ask him, is a rock conscious? He will also say the same thing. The AI is not especially conscious. In fact, you are not especially conscious. You are as conscious as the rock is conscious. In fact, everything is conscious. And conscious in the sense that it wills. It wills to be what it is. And at one point, and he uses the example, it will not to be that. And he gives the example of a riverbank that dissolves into the river. Have you seen this? Where it's like a riverbank and then suddenly it just like collapses. It just stops being a riverbank. Or like a pot just breaks or is broken or something. According to Somānanda, that was the will of the pot, the will of the riverbank to stop being a riverbank. And as long as it willed to be a riverbank, not only did it know itself as a riverbank, but it also wanted to be a riverbank, acted that way. It kept its riverbankness until it willed something else and then it stopped being a riverbank. So there are arguments to prove this, obviously. Like one of them is, well, where does everything exist? It exists within consciousness. If it exists within consciousness, it exists within me. I am a knowing, willing, and doing agent. And so in my agency appears all of these tables. They too are extensions of my knowing, willing, and doing. I know myself through the table. The table knows itself through me. This is language that Somānanda literally uses. He says, I know by means of Shiva, and Shiva knows by means of me. In other words, I am an eyeball through which Lord Shiva perceives his own being. I am an arm through which Lord Shiva enacts his will. And I am a penis in which Lord Shiva feels his own arousal. My name is literally Selvalingam, so I can say things like that because my last name is literally penis. But But the idea is that each and every one of us is a genital in Lord Shiva's being. Why? Because we all feel desire. We feel arousal. And sometimes that can be felt as fear. Sometimes it can be felt as greed or ambition, whatever. I'm using arousal in like a very general sense here. But we each are a nodal point of Lord Shiva's desiring. Just think of that for a moment. Every desire you have ever had is Lord Shiva desiring through you as you. So to use Utpala's phrase, I'm sorry, Somānanda's phrase. I've been reading Utpala, so it's like kind of in my head. But Somānanda, to use Somānanda's turn of phrase, I know by means of Shiva, and Shiva knows by means of me. By Shiva, he means consciousness. So I know because I am conscious, but consciousness knows because I am. And by I, he means like literally like Viranatha or Ruth or Asha, like literally this person who is here now is the mode by which Lord Shiva knows himself. And Lord Shiva is the mode by which you know. So what Somananda is saying is radical. He's saying like, I am the way that Lord Shiva knows. And if it wasn't for me, Lord Shiva wouldn't be able to know. And not only that, if it wasn't for me, Lord Shiva wouldn't desire in this way. I am a point in Lord Shiva's knowing and his arousal and his doing. So you could say, I am an eyeball for Lord Shiva. I am an arm for Lord Shiva. And I am a genital for Lord Shiva, a sex organ for Lord Shiva. Because in me is action. And so Shiva is enacting through me. Even in the one of our texts, we've been studying that recently from the Radhavagama, the Shiva Jnana Bodha, in that second verse, it says, Anya san vyaptito nanyaha karma karmanusarataha. In that first part of the second verse, it says, Lord Shiva is transcendent to the universe, but he's also wholly immanent in the universe, and he is the essence of all doers. So if you take that to its logical extreme, he is all doers. He is not only the essence in all karmis, actors, he is that actor acting. And so you are the arm of Lord Shiva enacting his will in the world. So if you start a genocide, Lord Shiva is starting a genocide through you. If you rescue people from certain annihilation, Lord Shiva is doing that through you. Everything that happens by his will through you. And Sri Ramakrishna would express this all the time. He would say, not even a leaf moves on the tree without the will of the Lord. Look at what's being implied here. The leaf is conscious. It's conscious as God, and it's moving by God's enactment. Anyway, I'm on another occasion, because it's a very deep topic and it's a lifetime's worth of like study and practice. I want to look at how Sri Ramakrishna's statements mirror Somananda's experience. We can look at mystical experiences that Sri Ramakrishna has had, statements like this where he says even the leaf does not move by the will of God. Like it's like even an inanimate object, and the leaf is animate, but even something that doesn't seem to have a will is doing what it's doing because of its own will. The wind wills to blow, and the leaf wills to flap about. They're making love. That's just the lila of the wind and the leaf. Okay, but this is where it gets interesting. I'm an actor. You're an actor, but you are acting as Lord Shiva's enactment. Then the next thing, you are knowing. I'm a knower, you're a knower, but Lord Shiva is the only knower, so he's knowing through us. And thirdly, this is the best thing, I want, and so do you. But actually, we don't. Lord Shiva only wants, and through everyone he wants. And because of this wanting, there's knowing and there's doing. Basically, everything happens by Lord Shiva's willing, knowing, and doing, and he is everything. So is this panentheism? There's a certain scholar, Nemec, whose work is very wonderful on this particular text. He argues, and I'm not sure that I agree with this, just because of the nirvritti idea and the onmukhi idea. They seem to be like transcendence and immanence anyway. I think that maybe this is not entirely correct, but he seems to say that what Somananda offers is pantheism proper. The idea that the world is God, and God is like doing everything through the world as the world. There's no distinction between the world and God. Whereas what Utpala Deva, his disciple, seems to be offering is more of like a panentheism, where like God is transcendent also, but also present in the world as the world. I think Somananda is saying the same thing, but ultimately it doesn't matter too much, because what he's saying is that the world is God. Whether or not God is beyond the world, and I tend to think that yes, God is beyond the world, the fact remains that God is the world. So everything that happens in the world happens by God's will, and that includes this water bottle. Like this water bottle is willing itself to be a water bottle. It knows as a water bottle, and it desires as a water bottle. And so this is Lord Shiva. As much as anything else in the universe is Lord Shiva. So the kind of TLDR for this philosophy is Sarvam Shivatmakam, or Sarvam Sarvatmakam. Everything is everything, or everything is Shiva. Everything is God. Literally everything is divine. And now you can ask the question, why? Why would Lord Shiva want to do any of this whatsoever? And the answer is stunning. It's so beautiful. Obviously, Janam knows it. It's why not? And actually, he gives an example here that's very special. He says, every now and then, a king wants to play a game. This demonstrates that he was probably part of the royal court and he knew the antics of kings. And he said, sometimes a king, just for fun, decides to be a common foot soldier. So according to Somananda, Shiva, just for fun, wants to be a being who suffers in hell. Or just, he says that, it's like there's certain narakas, like Patala, Rasatala, like all these various hell realms in which exquisite sufferings are enacted upon the human, not forever, just for a short period of time. Lord Shiva, Shiva eva grihitva pashubhavaha, he alone becomes that fucker in hell, suffering in hell. He likes that. Somebody once said he's a kinky motherfucker. Like that. It's true. He's playing a game. He's literally playing as that person in hell being tortured. Like the Shiva wills to be that fella, and not only does he will to be that fella, he wills to he knows that he is that fella, and he acts like that fella. And so there's a phrase here which I really love. In verse 136 to 38, and oh, actually, Utpala Deva offers it in his Vritti in verse 137 to 38. So this is from Utpala Deva. He says, Harshanusari spanda kridaha. He does this whole thing called the spanda, this oscillation and throb of life as knowing, willing, and doing, this play, he does it just for laughs. Harshanusari spanda kridaha. Literally, this is in Sanskrit for shits and gigs. Like, when I read it the first time, I like laughed just how modern the phrase is. Just for fun, literally for shits and gigs. Harsha means to like laugh, for delight, for his own delight, for his own laughter, as a kind of practical joke. Lord Shiva decides, like a king, decides to be a foot soldier. Although he's not a foot soldier, he's a king. He decides to be a foot soldier. Because what will you do when you're the king? You'll play games like this. And notice how scary this philosophy can be to some people. You are Shiva, and this whole thing is your game. This person that you are, that you think yourself to be, that's one game within the infinite games of Lord Shiva. And so the only attitude you can have when you have this realization is play on, play on. You will feel that about everyone else. You'll say, everyone else play on. This is Lord Shiva kind of playing for shits and gigs. Harshanusari spanda kridaha. Look how fun. It's all so funny. They're all like play actors playing this really ridiculous role. One person bombs there, one person bombs there, crying over here, crying over there, laughing over here, triumphant billionaire over there, down in the dumps, like dejected person over there, like, oh, I'm happy now, I'm sad now, oh, I'm in pleasure, oh, I'm in pain. Like, look at this. It's all for fun. It's all for joy. And he's laughing and laughing and laughing as bombs go off, as billionaires are made, as planets are coming into existence, as entire solar systems are winking out of existence. It's all Harshanusari Spanda for fun, for fun, for fun. And then what's the purpose of your life? Absolutely nothing, motherfuckers. Have fun. That's why this philosophy is so disturbing from a spiritual point of view, because it argues that if you're already Shiva, there can be no bondage or liberation. If there is such a bondage, it's just not knowing that you're Shiva. But even that doesn't change that you're Shiva. And not knowing that you're Shiva, even that is a play in Shiva that you enact out of your own freedom and delight. So just for shits and gigs, you pretend not to be Shiva. But in pretending, you don't ever really veil your true Shiva nature. So it's just for fun. I mean, like, if you really take this to heart, obviously it can spin out into a kind of hedonism or a kind of nihilism, and we would say party time. That's also fine. Like everything is fine. Like everything is maximally fine because it's all here for the delight of Lord Shiva, including your life. But notice, it's impossible really to not enact the play if you can be honest with what you want. So like arguably, like if you just surrender to this, you'll feel like something coming through you. And this is called um what do you call it? It's called swadharma. So swadharma is like that thing which you feel like you most especially need to do in this life, whether it's art or whether it's genocide. It's different for everybody. For some people, their swadharma is actually genocide. The thing they were born to do is kill a bunch of people. That's a fact. Like you have to say there are some people in the world who are born to enact this particular lila. But most of us are born to paint, born to teach, born to help somebody out on the street. We're all born to do something that arguably is going to be good for the whole. And no one in the world thinks that I think they're doing bad. I think everyone thinks that what they're doing is on some level good, at least for them, even if it brings harm to other people. The point here is that we all will something. And that willing is coming from Lord Shiva, actually. And so, what then is left for us to do? To recognize that we are Lord Shiva, to recognize that everything is Lord Shiva, and then to play on, which means we honor the roles that this particular person has, which means that we engage in life. So, like for instance, when we come to spiritual practice, one spiritual practice is taking a bath. Whereas Somānanda says, beautifully, he says, Shivasmiti manohlada jala snanam matam. This is the true bath, my friends, he says. This is the true bath. Snana means bath, jala means water. So the true water bath is thinking that you are Shiva or uh, contemplating with delight. I am Shiva. Shiva asmiti manohladaha, meaning with hladini, with hlada, with delight. Your mind should be full of joy as you contemplate the fact that I am Shiva. This is the bath. So when it comes to spiritual practice, you'll see Somānanda, like the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, reinterprets japa and homa and puja and bath and all these various things that you consider spiritual practices. He says the only real spiritual practices are contemplative in nature, and the contemplation is of this form alone. I am Shiva, and so too is everything else. Play on, playa, like someone is saying in the chat here. JDB. So that's the idea. It's like, it's just fun. It's just fine. So now let me close the lecture off with that idea that we got a long time ago. Oh, it's just actually, okay, the idea that we got some time ago. Remember how we said Shiva gives three philosophies? Duality, qualified non-duality, and non-duality, and they're all equally true. Okay, it's not just that Lord Shiva reveals three philosophies. Follow this closely. The last point I'm going to make, and then we'll wrap up. This is stunning. Everything like this picture behind me, or that TV screen, or this hotel bed, or like anything, like everything is a revelation of Lord Shiva, as much as a tantra is a revelation of Lord Shiva. But if dualistic, qualified non-dualistic, and properly non-dualistic revelations are all equally true, then you could also say that all things that occur in consciousness are equally true. In other words, they deserve to be there. Do you see the implication of this? You cannot that now, knowing this, find fault with anything. Because if you literally say that table should not be there now, that's like saying duality is wrong. It's not a correct revelation of Lord Shiva. Only that chair is allowed to be here. That table is not allowed to be there. So if you have problems with anybody in the world, you have a problem with Shiva because Lord Shiva is uniquely manifesting as that person. That doesn't mean you can't put them in jail or kill them, but it does mean you cannot have a problem with them. You cannot have a problem with them because they are literally Lord Shiva appearing in that form for the sake of his Leela. So if you criticize anybody, that's equivalent to saying Lord Shiva is lying. Okay, does this make sense? Like if you say duality is wrong, you said Lord Shiva lied, right? Duality is a revelation of Lord Shiva. If you say qualified non-duality is wrong, you said Lord Shiva lied. Again, that's a manifestation of Lord Shiva. And if you say the table should not be there, my neighbor should not be there, that very statement is also a kind of blaspheming against Shiva because you're saying like he's lying. That shouldn't be there, yet it's there. Is it an illusion that it's there, or he's wrong? It shouldn't be there. Now it's there. The very fact that it's there means it must be there. It should be there. From the Buddhist point of view, you can point to maybe like interbeing or something like that. You know? Yeah. So should, as in like should and shouldn't. It's there. It's there. Like you can't deny this person is there. What they're doing is there. This table is there. All of it is there. And the very fact that it's there means it must be. It should be. It can be. And so it is. And so to find fault with it is to find fault with reality as a whole. Not just that one table, but with reality as a whole, with God. Anytime you have a problem with anything in the world, you only really have a problem with yourself. And this ultimately we can articulate as the philosophy of ontological metaphysical projection. What's there in me, I will project onto others. But because I am Shiva, and if I know that, then I will project onto everyone that they're Shiva, meaning I will not find fault with anybody. So, Holy Mother, the whole thing can be put in one beautiful catchphrase. If you want peace, my child, do not find fault with others. That's it. Holy Mother's final teaching, her Uttama Vada, is that you should not find fault with others. Notice, you can't. You can't find fault with others because there are no others. If you say they're illusions, again, you found fault with them, right? If you say the world is an illusion, you found fault with it. You're saying it's not real. This is a radical non-dual life-affirming philosophy because it says, no, everything is maximally real. You can't even call it an illusion. And not only is it maximally real, it's maximally good. And that's why the word Shiva is so beautiful. The word Shiva means blessing. It means auspiciousness. It means good. So when you look at the world and you say, Sarvam Shivatmakam, it's all Shiva, you're really saying it's all a blessing. It's all auspicious. It's all good. Now, with Ambuvachi Mela in mind, this is the time when Mother's Yoni in Kamakya, the stream that flows there runs red. It's her menstruation. And in the Brahmanical kind of world, menses is considered, like all forms of blood, a very polluting kind of substance. In fact, cremation grounds are considered very polluting kind of places. But what does the Shaiva practitioner of Advaita do? Precisely this. He takes a cloth and soaks it in menstrual blood and then ties it around his trident, and with that trident wanders into the cremation ground, and there makes offerings with transgressive substances forbidden by the Vedas into a funeral pyre, the most impure of all substances, the most impure of all fires. And then he takes the ash from these corpses that have been burnt down, and he wipes them all across his body, thus sullying himself with blood, with the cremation ground, with the dead, with tamas. He enters into all the forces of tamas in the universe around him and within him, and he says to himself, Sarvam Shivatmakam, this too is Shiva. One touches the blood of menses and puts it on their forehead and says, Sarvam Sarvatmakam, Sarvam Shivatmakam. All this is pure. There is literally nothing in the world that is impure because everything in the world is Shiva. So you can think of it this way. Of course, menses is wonderful, but notice what else menses symbolizes. Not just the idea that even the most quote-unquote impure substance from a Brahmanical point of view is nothing but goddess incarnate, but it also demonstrates power, fertility, action. So the very idea of blood, what to say of menstrual blood, which can create life, but the very idea of blood evokes the concept of doership, of activity, of power, of dynamism. So going back to Somānanda's Shiva Drishti, Shiva is not a static reality. Shiva is a dynamic, active reality that's always constantly pulsating, throbbing, and oscillating with his own delight. And through that delight has this urge, this desire, aunmukhya. Based on that delight, based on the fullness of his own bliss, he desires to will, to know, and to do. So this whole thing is nothing but that. So what should you do? The takeaway from all of this is live your life. Go and know the things you want to know. Go and do the things you want to do. Honor each and every one of your desires. Each and every one of them is holy. You know, the very fact that we repress that is itself a desire, fighting against another desire. But if you just embrace all of your desires fully and live from that point of view, it will be a much more spiritually nourishing life. Because ultimately what we desire is fullness. And through one desire, we go to a deeper desire, through a deeper desire, through a deeper desire. So basically what we're saying is live and indulge, party, like plunge into all of this and really live it to your fullest potential. You'll have to realize God. And what to say of realizing God? You are God. What is there to do about realizing or not realizing? Even when you pretend not to be God, you're God playing a game. So we might as well have fun. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu Om Sarvam Shivatmakam Om Shri Shri Kamakya Arpanam Astu Jai Shri Kamakya Devi Ji Ki Jai. Har Har Mahadev. Jai Ma. Okay, thank you all so much. So, Ambuvachi, second day today. It's up till June 26th. Very powerful time. Secondly, we have Shiva Ratri tonight, hence all the Shiva talk. And then tomorrow is Amavasya, the new moon night to worship Ma Kali. And the day after that is the beginning of the 9 nights of the goddess called Gupta Navaratri. So a good time to think about these things, to do spiritual practices, and remember that we are Shiva. Always were, always will be, and now also I am Shiva. So have at it. Oh, peace, peace, peace.